Family is one of the most significant elements to the human experience. Having a connection with people who share a relationship to us, something that binds us together, that keeps us all close together, it gives us roots, it provides us with a home. It can be good things, it can be not so good things. I mean, we all have that cousin, don't we? But it gives us some connection as to where we are in history and where we belong in history past. It's just something that is something very cool that we can connect with on some level. Over the last several decades, there's been a growing surge of companies that have popped up with the sole purpose of trying to help people connect themselves to their ancestors and to find out where they come from and what kind of family life they've have behind them, to see where their place in history is. And for a lot of people, these things have helped reveal some really interesting things about their family and about where they come from. Just like it did for Jay Spice. Jay is a pastor and a family man in suburban Rockville, Maryland. Just a normal guy living an ordinary life. By all accounts, he's just a loving father and a loving husband and a dedicated pastor to his congregation. His father, Henry, had been looking into their family history for quite some time to try to figure out where it was that they came from and where it is that they belong and what their connection is. And it was something that Jay found very interesting, but he himself really didn't feel like he had the time to pursue it himself, just with all the other elements of life that he had to deal with. But when his father, Henry, passed away, Jay, out of love and loyalty to him, felt that his father's work needed to be finished. And so Jay began tracing back his family lineage. And before too awful long, Jay found himself excited by it. This hobby that he had created had become something that was very time-consuming for him. He just was fascinated to find out more and more about his family lineage. He'd spend hour after hour on things like Ancestry.com and other websites that are dedicated to things like that. He'd be up till 2 or 3 in the morning just poring over all these facts and beginning to make connections and building a family tree very loosely, piece by piece. But it wasn't until he joined something called the DNA Match Genesis, which would match up his DNA with a massive list of worldwide genetics and stuff to help him pinpoint exactly what family and what line he belongs in. And when he got the results back, Jay found something quite shocking. He was blood relatives to royalty. Jay found out that he was closely related to the royal family of Benin, a small country in Africa that's just west of Nigeria. It was something that was exciting to him. He couldn't believe that this is what turned up, that out of all the things that could have come up in his family history, this is the thing that should be the case, that he is in fact royalty himself. So the obvious question for Jay became, well, what should I do with this information? How should I proceed with this? I mean, it's not like he can just add the king of Benin on Facebook and then hit him with a DM. It's not like there's white pages for African royalty anywhere lying around. So he didn't quite know what the next step should be for him. But not long afterwards, he found out that a religious leader from Benin who had close ties to the royal family was actually going to be stateside speaking at an event. And it just so happened, almost as if by divine circumstances, that Jay lived not too awful far from where the event was going to take place. So of course, Jay did everything that he could to try to be there. He wasn't going to miss this opportunity to find a further connection to his family history, and he could just feel the spirit of his father urging him on to keep going. So Jay gathered up all of his stuff. He gathered up all this DNA evidence because he didn't want them to think he was some kind of a crazy person. And he drove to this event. And it wasn't too awful long that he found himself speaking with one of the aides that happened to be working with the religious leader. And as Jay explained to this person all this stuff that was going on and showed him the DNA evidence that pointed him as being royalty of Benin, this aide handed Jay a small piece of paper, almost like it was an everyday occurrence. And on this little piece of paper was a phone number. This aide had given Jay the phone number, the direct cell phone number to the king. Yeah. The next morning, Jay found himself dialing the numbers. And as the phone began to ring, Jay found himself wondering, wait, how am I supposed to start this conversation? When they pick up, what do I say? How does one start a conversation with the king in the first place, let alone a conversation that's going to result in, hey, I might be a blood relative of yours? Do I start off by saying, Your Majesty, or do I start off by saying, hey, cousin, guess what? How do you start this whole conversation? And so when the line finally went live, Jay found himself almost having a nervous breakdown trying to figure out what to say next, but it turned out he didn't really need to worry about that because the line immediately went dead. The king hung up on him. Jay was almost relieved in that moment because he didn't know what to say in that time period there. But after a little bit of time went by, just a few short hours, Jay felt it was worth trying again. So he composed himself and called the phone number again. And this time, the phone was answered. But it wasn't the king that picked up the phone. Jay found himself on the phone line with the Queen of Benin, who fortunately spoke English. Jay and the Queen spent a little bit of time chatting with each other, and Jay informed her why he was calling and how he'd been on this journey to figure out his family's roots and lineage, and discovered that he had a direct bloodline with the royal family of Benin. And the Queen, being a wise queen as she was, wasn't just willing to take him at his word, and she gave him an email address to send all of his findings and all of his information to her so that their experts could determine the validity of his claim, to find out if in fact he was who he said he was. Jay sent the email along that night and nervously waited. Jay found it difficult to sleep, to try to figure out what this next step was. He was so excited about what the response might be. So it's not too surprising that when he heard his iPad buzz at 4 o'clock in the morning, Jay sprang up out of his bed, grabbed the iPad, and opened it. The Queen had sent him a response. And her entire email began with 2 simple words. Dear Prince. The Queen went on to explain that they were so happy and they were smiling as they read through everything, and as they continued to check all these things to figure out if in fact Jay was related to them. And every test they ran came back. He is. Jay Spice, this normal, everyday pastor, learned for the first time in his life that he was actually a prince. Jay was so excited in that moment that he reached over and shook his wife and told her, "Sweetheart, I'm a prince, and that means that you're a princess." But his wife, not really feeling the same level of excitement as he was at, again, 4 in the morning, said, "That's great, sweetheart, but I need to get up at 6. And then she went back to sleep. Not long after all of this, Jay found himself flying to Benin. When he arrived, hundreds of people met him at the plane. They were cheering, they were excited, they were overjoyed that Jay had made it. As soon as he got to Benin, he began the process of just kind of learning his roots and learning more about this country. He walked around the palace of Benin 3 times. And the reason why he did that was because in their culture and their context, it symbolized a return. He visited ancient shrines and he learned the history of his homeland. And finally, Jay was dressed in royal garb and he was enthroned as one of the princes of Benin. To signify his new stance, the king of Benin gave him a new name, Vidikon Deka, which roughly translates to the child who came back. Jay had spent his entire life believing he was one thing, one person, that he had one identity. But because he was persistent in his pursuit, he found out he was meant to be someone else entirely. But sometimes that's just what God does in our lives. See, we spend so much of our lives believing ourselves to be this one person, this one identity, this one job, this one thing. We get so wrapped up in this identity, so used to this notion that this is who we're supposed to be, that the idea that we could possibly be someone else or that God had called us to be something greater, it almost comes across as crazy to us. Because it's just something that doesn't resonate within us. We've attached ourselves to this one notion, and yet God has something completely different in mind for us. He has a completely different nature in mind for us, a completely different character for us. That's really what happened for Jacob. You may be somewhat familiar with the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis, but we're going to kind of look at his life today. And honestly, if we take a step back and we look objectively at the life of Jacob, it's kind of hard to think of him as being a hero of the faith, because so many of the things that he does in the bulk of his life that's listed in the book of Genesis is somewhat villainous in nature. I mean, even his name, it gives him somewhat indication that he is somewhat villainous here. In the original Hebrew, the name Jacob means to supplant or even to replace. And the connotation that that's given is not exactly a good thing. Jacob is the twin brother of Esau. And even though they're twins, nobody would ever mistake them as being twins. I mean, as the father of twins everywhere we go, people have a hard time telling the difference between Robin and Adrian because they do look so similar. But Jacob and Esau did not have that problem all the way from the day they were born. Esau was very tall and very masculine and very hairy. Jacob was kind of short, a little frail, kind of fair-skinned. Esau was an outdoorsman who loved to hunt and loved to be doing all the things that big burly men would do, and Jacob preferred to stay inside and just kind of do the delicate work around the house. Esau was clearly their father Isaac's favorite. And Jacob was quite possibly the first biblical example of a mama's boy. The two of them could not be more different. But Esau was the firstborn, really only by seconds, because as they come out of the womb, Jacob is actually holding on to his brother's heel. So he's just kind of the firstborn by moments even. As the firstborn, though, that means that Esau is entitled to the lion's share of their father's estate. Isaac, the son of Abraham, had been given this huge estate by his father, and now as the father of Esau and Jacob, Esau is entitled to the bulk of his father's stuff. Jacob could have first pick of all of his father's items and his animals and his land, and everything that Isaac has to his name, Esau gets first right too. But that's not the only thing that Esau is promised. See, Isaac, as the son of Abraham, was given the same blessing that his father had been given by God. And so Isaac, as their father, now gets to share this blessing with his son. And it's going to go to his firstborn, Esau. Jacob doesn't really let this sort of thing sit well with him. I mean, why should Esau be the one to get all of this great stuff when he's literally only seconds older than Jacob? Why should Jacob be left out of all of this for something that wasn't his choice? If he had gone differently, Jacob could have had all of this stuff. If one thing could have been different that entire day that they were born, maybe things would have been different in Jacob's life. Why should Jacob only get leftovers over a matter of moments? One day, Esau presents Jacob with a golden opportunity, a chance for Jacob to do something underhanded. See, Jacob has been fixing a lentil stew, and Esau has been out all day working outside and hunting and doing all the things that he's done, and he hasn't eaten anything today. And so Esau comes in and he smells this stew that his brother is making, and man, it's just kind of hitting him right in that gut. And so Esau presents to his brother that I'm starving to death. Could you please just give me one of these stew? And I think this is one of the first biblical examples of what I like to call the man starving. It's where, yeah, you're real hungry, and yeah, you're going to eat a big meal as soon as you get a chance. But the reality is you probably could wait a little bit longer. You're just kind of making it sound worse than what it really is. Yes, ladies, we do that from time to time. But the smell of this stew is just so overwhelming that Esau is just constantly demanding that Jacob give him some. And so Jacob agrees, as long as Esau is willing to give Jacob his birthright. Now that's a fairly steep price, don't you think, over a bowl of stew? I mean, I've had some pretty good stews in my life, but I don't think there's ever been one that was just so good I was willing to sacrifice pretty much everything that was promised to me. So Esau kind of looks at this moment. He's hungry and he's starving to death, and the stew smells fantastic. But if I take this, that means I'm giving up what was always meant to be mine. And yet somehow Esau agrees to this incredibly steep price. And I got to be honest with you, I've always kind of wondered, like, how good was that stew? Like, when Esau finally took a bite, was it finally worth the price that he paid? Because, I mean, that would have to be some amazing stew in my mind. And now I'm just hungry. Sometime shortly thereafter, Isaac decides that it's time to give his blessing to Esau. But before Isaac does so, he gives Esau a task. He tells Esau to go out and go hunting and to kill an animal and then prepare its meat and bring it back to Isaac so that he may eat it. And once he has done that, once he's fulfilled that task, Isaac will give Esau the blessing he's been waiting his entire life for. So Esau heads off into the woods to go and find. But what Esau didn't know was that the whole time their mother, Rebekah, happened to be overhearing this conversation between Isaac and Esau. And again, Jacob was always Rebekah's favorite. He was her special little guy. So Rebekah, with the help of Jacob, began to concoct this plan of how they're going to deceive Isaac into giving the blessing into Jacob. She tells Jacob to go out and to kill 2 of the small goats that they have, to bring them into the house, and that Rebekah will prepare their meat, and Jacob is to take the skins and put it on his arms. Because again, Esau's a very hairy guy, and Jacob isn't. So Jacob goes off and he gets the goats, and their mother prepares the meat, and Jacob puts the skins on his arms. The whole time he's got to be thinking, there's no way this is going to work. Well, I don't know, Dad has been getting kind of blind lately. Maybe if I play it just right, this will work. And he brings the meat into his father. And sure enough, Isaac's eyesight has gotten so poor that their act of deception works. And Jacob is given the blessing that Esau had always been promised. Esau is not happy about that. And again, Esau is a very large, very muscular man. And Jacob isn't. So Jacob does exactly what we might expect from somebody who just cheated their own brother out of something that was always rightfully his. He runs away. Our hero. Jacob runs to Rebekah's hometown and actually goes to stay with Rebekah's brother Laban. When he gets there, he meets Rachel, Laban's daughter. And immediately Jacob falls head over heels in love with her. Like right away, he sees Rachel, and like a shot through the heart, he is just completely ready to just love this woman for the rest of his life. Laban agrees to let Jacob marry Rachel if Jacob will agree to work for him for 7 years. And so for the first time ever, we're kind of given an indication that when he wants to be, Jacob can be persistent, because he does in fact go to work for Laban for 7 years. And finally, after the end of the 7 years, the day of his wedding comes. And he goes through the wedding procedures and goes through everything. But the next morning, he wakes up to discover it wasn't Rachel he married. It was Leah, Rachel's older sister. It had to be one thick veil. Laban says that he'll if Jacob can agree to work for him for another 7 years, that then he'll get to marry Rachel, that'll be okay, that he can still marry Rachel, but if he agrees to work for him for 7 years. And apparently Rachel must have been really, really special to Jacob, because he agreed to this. And if you think about the situation for a second, the swindler just got swindled. Finally, after Jacob has worked for Laban for all this time, Jacob decides he wants to go off and to build a life for himself. But Laban doesn't want him to do this. See, because all the time that Jacob has lived in Laban's house, because he has the blessing of God from his father Isaac, who got it from his father Abraham, who got it from God himself, it's really benefited Laban to have Jacob here. It's almost like Jacob has the Midas touch, and everything that he touches turns to gold, and that gold goes right into Laban's pockets. And so Laban does everything he can to try to get Jacob to stay. And the two of them actually get into a heated disagreement over it. And there's conflict that's brewing within this family. And so what does Jacob do when this conflict arises? He does what he always does. He runs away. Eventually, Laban catches up to him, and the two of them work out an arrangement and work out an agreement together. And the agreement results in that Jacob is never going to be able to set foot on Laban's land again. But because of the geography of where they're at, that really only leaves Jacob with one direction to head: back towards home, back towards his brother, who is probably still mad. So as they're getting closer to his brother, Jacob has been thinking about how am I gonna work through this situation? How can I make this happen? Maybe if I appease my brother with large amounts of animals and gifts and servants and different things, then maybe that'll be enough for Esau to not be so angry that he kills me where I stand. He kind of works out all these different scenarios in his head, and finally Jacob gets in his mind that the most appropriate thing for him to do is to take all of his possessions and all of his family and split them in half. And he would send one half on ahead, and the other half would lag behind, because if that way, if Esau decides to go ahead and attack the first half, well, the other half has a chance to get away. And the implication in here is that Jacob's also going to get away with the other half. He's going to turn tail and run like he always does. But it's while Jacob is getting ready for the situation, he finds himself alone for a few moments. And when he's alone, something incredible happens. Something truly amazing takes place in Jacob's life. We see it in Genesis chapter 32, verses 24 through 27. So if you've got your Bible, or if you've got a Bible app open, meet me in Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 24. It says, Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. And then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not, unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. As Jacob is hanging out in the middle of the night, just kind of alone and left to his own thoughts, he begins to hear footsteps coming from behind him. And before he even has a chance to turn around and see who this person is that's coming at him, he finds himself in the middle of a wrestling match with this guy. This unknown assailant has come and attacked him, and the two of them begin to wrestle with each other out of the crystal clear blue, I might add. And so you got to think that there's all kinds of thoughts that are running through Jacob's mind as this is happening. He's got to be thinking, who is this guy? And why is this happening? And where can I find a foreign object? But something else comes across Jacob's mind in this. Another thought passes through Jacob's mind as he's wrestling this unknown person. 3 simple words come across the mind of Jacob in the midst of all of this. Not this time. This time Jacob's not going to run away. This time Jacob's not going to be the coward he has been over and over again in his life. This time he's going to stay. This time he's going to fight. And this time he's going to win. Before long, Jacob gets the upper hand. He reverses the man's figure 4 leg lock into a Bret the Hitman Hart type sharpshooter. At least that's how I like to imagine this whole thing going down. And the guy begins to realize that Jacob Jacob's persistence has made this fight unwinnable for him. And so he begins to beg with Jacob to let him go because it's almost daylight, man. We've been fighting for a long time together. So just let me go so we can go on about our business. I'm sorry I messed with you. But Jacob refuses to let him go until he blesses Jacob. This unknown assailant reaches out and he touches the hip bone of Jacob. And the indication that we're given in the original translations of this is that the touch that was given on Jacob's hip was no more than the touch that you might give somebody to get their attention when they have their back turned towards you. But this light touch is enough that Jacob's hip bone dislocates. The pain has to be excruciating. It has to be almost overwhelming. I think any one of us in that moment, if we felt that level of pain that Jacob had to be feeling, all of us would have just immediately let the guy go. But Jacob fights through the pain. He remains persistent in his struggle with this man, refusing to break the hold until this man blesses him. And so finally, the stranger asks Jacob what his name is. And I got to be honest with you, that seems like a pretty weird question to ask at this time. I mean, it's not weird that Jacob would ask this guy's name because that would make sense. He doesn't know who it is that's attacking him. And yet, this perfect stranger who just decided to break into a wrestling match asked Jacob what his name is. What an unusual question. When Jacob tells him who his name is, his opponent has something incredible to let him in on. We see it in Genesis 32, verse 28. He says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." The first time in his life that Jacob faces conflict, and instead of running away from it, decides to hunker down and fight through it and be persistent in his fight. And it happens to be with God. Yeah, I'm pretty sure God was holding back during that match. God tells Jacob that because he was persistent, because he showed he can be persistent through this, because he was willing to struggle and fight through, that God was going to reveal something about Jacob he didn't know about himself. God decides to change his name, and to change his name to something that's a little more appropriate to his true character. Because Jacob was persistent, God changed his name to Israel, a name that means fighter or contender, or even contends with God. That's who Jacob was really meant to be. That's his true character. Because he was persistent, God revealed to Jacob who he was always meant to be. Like we said last week, persistence is not easy. It's incredibly difficult for us to remain persistent in our faith. And it seems like right now, in the time of human history that you and I are living through, it's almost harder than it's ever been beforehand to stay persistent with God when there are so many other things happening around the world, when there are so many things that are distracting and so many things that are disheartening and so many things that are just flat out hard for us. It's so difficult to remain persistent in our faith. But we know that we need to remain persistent because that's who God calls us to be. But man, there are just so many other times where it just feels like it'd be so much easier for us to quit, to walk away, maybe even to run away like Jacob would. But persistence isn't just important for us to get to know who God is. Persistence in our relationship with God can reveal who we were always meant to be. Through persistence, God can reveal our true character. reveal to us the character that we are always supposed to have, to reveal to us the person that he created us to be. Think about all the different ways that God has shown the true character of people throughout Scripture. I mean, if we were to sit here and list it, we'd be here all day, listing the different names of people who were one thing for a while, but when they encountered God or when they pursued God in their lives and they were persistent through that, God changed who they were. God revealed their character. I mean, yeah, he certainly did that for Jacob. I mean, think about the disciples of Jesus. Each and every one of them, if you would have lined them up in that time period, you would have thought they're not even likely to change their clothes, let alone change the world. And yet, because of their encounter with Jesus and Jesus revealing to them who they were truly supposed to be, all of them, with the exception of Judas, went off to change the world because they believed in Jesus, and they were relentless in their pursuit of who he called them to be. And so God revealed to them who their true character is. I mean, for goodness sake, Paul wouldn't be Paul if God had not revealed to him his true character. It wasn't like for any of these guys, though, that they believed in Jesus and all of a sudden everything in their lives was super simple and easy. In fact, I would argue that for all of them, their lives became harder after their encounters with Jesus. But they remained persistent. They kept going even when things were hard. And because of that, God showed their true character. He revealed to each and every one of them who they were always meant to be. I believe that God wants to reveal something to you about yourself. I think that God wants to show you who you're truly supposed to be and what your character is truly supposed to be and who he created you to be. But it's not like God is just going to come knocking on your door with a slide projector and some fancy handouts. He's going to reveal it to you when you relentlessly pursue him, when you relentlessly, consistently, persistently chase after him. The more you pursue God, the more of your true character I believe God is going to show you. If we remain persistent, God will show us who we were always meant to be. Persistence isn't easy. Jacob thought that the easier path for him to take was the right path for him to take. So many of the conflicts that Jacob faced in his own life, his gut reaction was to run away from it. He always found that to be easier than to stay and fight. It wasn't until he was willing to stay and fight it out that he finally learned who he was always supposed to be. Maybe instead of running away from the things that cause us conflict in our own spiritual nature and our own walk with God, maybe instead of running away from those conflicts, maybe we need to hunker down. Maybe we need to get into a fighting stance and get ready to wrestle it out. Who knows? We might learn something. Maybe even something about ourselves. Yeah, the road is hard. Persistence is hard. We need to just keep going.